So my topic, the topic today is food security, and I kind of adapted a little bit from the original sort of marketing of this lecture, and I'm calling it Food Security and COVID-19 because I want to make it a little bit more topical and relate the issue of food security and global food security with the pandemic that I guess is touching pretty much everybody in one way or another on this call today. So first of all, we'll talk sort of more broadly about food security and the importance of food and agriculture. And first of all, I'm going to go back more than 200 years to Thomas Malthus, and I think many of you would have heard of Malthus. He was an author. In 1798, wrote a very famous publication called an essay on the principle of population. And in that, he talked of a gigantic, inevitable famine. And he described what was called a natural inequality of the forces of population and food production. And if you take a look at this little diagram here, you'll see that essentially what's happening, which he pointed out more than 200 years ago, is that we have population increasing essentially exponentially in a geometric manner, and not unlike what we see with COVID-19, to be honest. But we see food production increasing more linearly, more in an arithmetic way. So, the conclusion is that this is a recipe for disaster, that population will eventually outstrip our ability to produce food. So we've, periodically over the past more than 200 years, we've been seeing situations where from time to time, indeed, population does outstrip our ability to feed that population. On a global scale, but sometimes and more often on a local scale. Now, when you think about Malthus and what he basically was saying back then, you've got to remember that back in 1798 we had less than 1 billion people on the planet. Today we have 7.8 billion people in 2020. So kind of 8 times the population that we had back in 1798. So food is a big issue. Food is a fundamental issue. And Josette Chiron, who was the executive director of the World Food Program, which recently won, as you know, the Nobel Peace Prize, made a very important statement several years ago. And this is it. There's nothing more basic than food. If people don't have it, one of 3 things happen. They revolt, they migrate, or they die. Well, think about it. We've seen revolutions over food. We've seen migration of people fleeing places where there was inadequate food. In fact, we're seeing some of that, right at this time going on in parts of Ethiopia. And we've also seen a lot of death as a result of food shortages in different parts of the world. But there's a 4th thing that can happen too, and that is essentially malnutrition. And you can see here on the right of this slide, we can see 2 cross sections of brains, a normal brain and a malnourished brain. And the bottom line here is that when people are malnourished, and particularly when children are malnourished and infants are malnourished, and they talk about the first 1,000 days as being the most critical from conception to 2 years of age, we have malnourishment, which basically undermines the cognitive abilities and educational opportunities and ultimately livelihood opportunities of people who are affected by that form of malnutrition. It's called stunting, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So food is important, and we often use this term food security. So what exactly is food security? We talk about human security, now food security. So the security of being able to eat, but it's much more nuanced and much more complex than that. And I really like the definition that's used by the, it first came about in 1996 at the World Food Summit in Rome. And this is the definition, that food security is a situation when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now that's a mouthful, right? That's a lot of concepts are there incorporated, a lot of dimensions, if you like, of food security. It's not just being able to eat, it's being able for everyone to eat at all times, now and even in the future, and that the food has to be safe and nutritious. So there are these 6 dimensions of food security. Briefly, availability. There has to be enough food produced to be able to reach the places where people need that food. Importantly, there has to be access, because you can actually have food, and most famously, a couple of 100 years ago in the Irish famine, food was there, but people did not have access. And Amartya Sen has talked about this in other famines around the world, that you can actually have food, but unless people have economic access to that food, then they will go hungry. Utilization of food has to do with the importance of good health, clean water, sanitation. Stability of food availability and food security takes into account that we're often subjected to shocks and stresses of different kinds. And one example of that is COVID, but another is the shocks associated with climate. Agency is a new term that hasn't been used a lot in the concept of food security in the past, but it's nevertheless important. It refers to the ability of individuals or groups to be able to make choices about what they eat and the foods that they produce and how it's produced. And finally, sustainability, in very important in the concept of sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is that our food system should also incorporate practices that ensure that not only present generations, but future generations are able to access that food security. Now, let me quickly give you what I call my global nutrition or malnutrition scorecard. So this is in essence the current state of global food security. First thing, hunger. And in this case, the definition of hunger, which is the definition used by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, hunger really relates to energy deprivation, so essentially calories. So it doesn't say much about, or anything really about, the quality of the food. It talks about the energy content. And 690 million people on the planet, roughly 1 in 11, are basically going hungry, with respect to that indicator. Now, of those, approximately 135 million people are experiencing acute hunger. This is short-term, intense shortages of food. 135 million of those. The others within that 690 million is considered to be chronic hunger. This is long-term hunger, and that long-term hunger often ends up manifesting itself as stunting, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. About 150 million children under the age of 5 are stunted. That's 22% of all children on the planet under the age of 5. Wasting, so stunting is basically height per age, or height for age. Now, wasting is weight of the body mass per height. Okay, So essentially, if you think of it, it's thinness. And wasting is found in around 50 million children under the age of 5 throughout the world. Micronutrient deficiency, essential micronutrients like vitamin A, like iron, like zinc, and the like. About 2 billion people have shortages, have deficiencies in micronutrients. And then the big issue that's emerged over the past recent years is overweight and obesity. And more than 2 billion people on the planet are overweight or obese, and about a third of those are in the obese category. So when I add all this up, and you don't directly add it up because there's some intersections here of different categories, but ultimately it's a reasonable conclusion to make that around 4 billion people, around half of the world's population, are getting an unhealthy diet at this time. So we have this food system which isn't working all that well when we look at those numbers that I just presented to you, and in comes COVID-19. So what are the impacts of COVID-19 on the food system? Well, so it turns out that COVID-19 hits the malnourished hardest. And by malnourished, I'm thinking of the two categories, the undernourished, and if you'd like to call it the overnourished, those who are overweight and obese. First of all, the undernourished. So these are people living in food crises, experiencing undernutrition. They have compromised immune systems, and that makes them at greater risk of all infections, not just COVID-19, but essentially all infections. Now, on the other end of the scale, and I think many of you would have heard about that individuals who are overweight, and particularly those who are obese, and that means they have a body mass index of greater than 30, these individuals have weakened immunity. And so they're more vulnerable. 46% more likely to test COVID positive, 113% more likely to be hospitalized, 74% more likely to be admitted to an ICU, and 48% more likely to die than a non-obese individual. And they're also, with these conditions, they have diet-related NCDs, or non-communicable diseases like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and the like. All of these increase the complications associated with COVID-19. And finally, on this slide, vaccines are likely to be less effective with obese individuals. So, all this good news about vaccines, well, it's just not going to work as well with people who have these overweight and obesity conditions. So, in summary, the direct effect is that, we had and we have a nutrition-driven health crisis even before COVID came along. And what's happening is that this provides what I call a fertile ground for intensifying the severity and the extent of COVID-19. So to put it very, very bluntly, COVID-19 is killing off the most nutritionally vulnerable people. So what are the different ways in which COVID-19 can affect food supply and food demand? Now, let's start with supply. Now, the first point I want to make here is that overall global production of food is in fact, and at the start of the pandemic back earlier in the year, is basically at an all-time high. And particularly for the big cereal crops like rice and wheat and corn, which are the staple foods for virtually everybody, I would say, on this call today. So the prices haven't really increased very much as a result of COVID, a few percent only in terms of global prices. However, there have been export bans in some places, and this has caused some temporary price increases. And there's also been some shortages of migrant labor, and there's been some disruption of supplies. There have been kind of well-publicized shutdowns of processing facilities and transport. We've seen examples of how perishables like fruits and vegetables and animal products have been disrupted as a result of the supply chain interruptions caused by shortages of labor there. And ultimately, for the poorest, this can often result in coping strategies that have long-term implications, including the selling of assets. So people will sell their livestock, and in some cases, in stress situations, they will also sell their land. So more important, actually, than food availability and food supply is the impact of COVID on food access and food demand. And I think this is, all of you, I think, can understand this, because these economic shutdowns that we've been experiencing means that we're having a loss of jobs, loss of remittances, and in some cases, in localized cases, we're getting higher food prices. Now, all of these mean that the amount of, particularly for poor people, the amount of money that they're spending on food, it is decreasing, but it's actually increasing as a proportion of their budget, if you can understand that. And that's described in something called Engel's law. And those two graphs on the side there explain what that is. I won't go into it now, but the basic idea is the poorer you get, the more of the income that you have, you're spending on food. And it also means, my last bullet point there is, as your income declines, you've lost your job, you've lost your remittances, the poor are going to spend more of their money on starchy staples and less on more nutritious foods like meat, like vegetables, like fruits, and that's called Bennett's law. So ultimately, we have some serious impacts on essentially all forms of malnutrition. So healthy diets are even more important today than they were before. Now, let's look at poverty, and here's some modeling work that showed the impact of COVID as a result of lost employment, remittances, and increased food prices. So if we assume that per capita income was reduced by a figure of around 8%, it follows that an additional 6.7 million children are wasted. Okay, so we talked about before there being 50 million children in the world suffering from wasting. We're now talking, by the end of 2020, likely to be 57 million people, 57 million children under the age of 5 suffering from wasting. And when you couple this with a reduction in government services and international support in nutrition and health, the projection is that as many as 130,000 additional deaths of children under the age of 5 would result from COVID-19. So it's having a very high impact. With respect to overnutrition, the story is a bit mixed. We seem to be getting both positive and negative effects in these higher income settings. Now, on the downside, and I sort of think of that a little bit in my own experience, the disruption that we experience in terms of our daily routines as a result of extended confinement can lead to unhealthy weight gain. It can lead to increased consumption of comfort foods, high calorie foods, and reduced access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and frankly, reduced exercise in some cases. The upside is that in some settings, at least, more people are cooking at home, they're paying greater attention to healthy eating, and we've even seen spikes in prices of things like orange juice and avocados in the United States. And I was reading that ginger and turmeric consumption is increasing in Indonesia. So maybe there are some positives coming out of COVID in that sense. But the actual impact in terms of overnutrition, is it making it worse or is it improving it? It really is very context specific, and we can't really generalize at this fairly early stage of the pandemic. Now, another point I wanted to make was regarding social protection. Now, social protection is these are the various forms of support that usually governments and sometimes international agencies, that they provide to ensure access to safe and nutritious food, particularly for people who basically don't have that access now or have reduced access because of poverty, because of conflict, because of displacement and the like. The information that the World Food Programme has presented recently is that they expect that more than 250 million children in 90 countries are missing out on school meals. So one form of social protection is school meals. And WFP is saying that, because of the disruptions, a lot of kids are not getting an important school meal, which is essential for their nutrition. And governments have responded in a range of different ways to the extent that they can. But the fact is, social protection comes at a cost, right? Social protection is coming usually from governments, but it's also coming from relief agencies and UN agencies and the like. And it's quite likely that for some time to come, social protection mechanisms will be disrupted, and there will be major fiscal challenges as well as operational challenges to deliver adequate social protection to support those people who need it most. So finally, let's just reflect a little bit on what I've just been saying. I've been somewhat intensifying this in a very short period of time. But what are the main messages I want to share with you all today? The first one is that COVID-19 has exposed and amplified existing vulnerabilities of the food system. So the food system, as I indicated through my scorecard, is struggling to meet the needs of 7.8 billion people. And what COVID has done was really amplify the vulnerabilities of our food systems. And it's been mainly through food access. It's been less on the supply and production side. It's mainly been the disruption of food access and food utilization. And it's been really a test of the resilience at all levels. Resilience, ability to bounce back, ability to survive these shocks and to recover and to continue. And we think of that at the level of individuals, communities, businesses, governments, and even development agencies. The resilience has really been tested by COVID-19. So in conclusion, I would advocate 5 strategic actions in response to COVID-19, and also thinking about this in terms of a strategy for future pandemics. The first thing, the most important starting point, is stop the virus now. So even though we say, COVID-19, it's not just a health problem, it's an economic problem, it's a food security problem, it's still a health problem, all right? It still affects, goodness knows what the number is now in terms of millions of people around the world. So we first of all have to deal with that virus, whether it be these non-pharmaceutical approaches or hopefully with the rollout of vaccines in the coming year. The second key strategic action is that we have to keep, even in the crisis, we have to keep those food supply chains operational. And that means trade cooperation. It means enabling labor to move around, that they need to be able to move and work, and they need to do so safely as well. The third is we need to think about how to strengthen productivity and resilience of local food production systems. Now, many countries import a large quantity of the food. Now, I'm not saying that stop importing food and produce everything yourself. That's just not going to work. It's not feasible. It's not going to happen. But still, take a hard look at productivity and resilience of your own food production systems and see how we can learn from what we've seen, and can we improve our own production systems. I think we have to strengthen social protection and economic stimulus policies. I mentioned, social protection is really directed to those who aren't really in a position at this time to help themselves completely. So social protection should be part of every society. The richest, the poorest society need elements and components of social protection. And finally, I would say what we need to do is educate and support food consumers and move them towards healthier eating and healthier, or let's say not healthier, but improved food stewardship. And by that, I mean reducing the amount of food waste. So this is kind of a, I don't know, it's a kind of a lightning presentation around food security and the impact and effects of COVID-19. And so, but I hope it's given you a little bit of an introduction to this. I will stop sharing the screen now and see if you all have any questions. But just before I end, I just wanted to say that it was mentioned I'm director of the MPA in Development Practice, one of SIPA's master's programs. I also teach a course called Global Food Systems. So this is a one-semester course, where I cover a lot of these topics in much more detail. Obviously, over 14 weeks. But anyway, this is one of the key issues at the moment. How resilient is our food system, and how are we going to ensure that COVID doesn't undermine a lot of the progress and success we've had to date, but at the same time, how do we sort of rebuild our food system better, not just for COVID, but for future pandemics? Let me stop there and see if you guys have any questions.
Thank you, Professor Denning. We did get a few questions in the Q&A, and just a quick reminder, if you have questions you want to type, please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat to help us streamline. And if you want to ask your question on video, you can simply raise your hand and we'll give you the ability to do so as well.
Okay. Let me see. Do you think widespread starvation should be edited into the UN definition of what constitutes a refugee, as it causes such mass migration? Well, I mean, I don't know about definitions, but there's no doubt about it that if you look at the changes in the number of people who are food insecure, it's actually been rising the past few years, and it's obviously going to be a lot worse this year because of COVID. But it's very much to do with the disruptions, and this more often than not leads to refugee circumstances. I was looking a couple of days ago, I think it was on Al Jazeera, and they were describing the crisis currently in Tigray region of Ethiopia, and they were interviewing people moving into neighboring Sudan. And these people hadn't eaten for days, so they're hungry for sure. But they were also saying, we've got malaria as well. So you've got this, this combination of hunger, compromised immune system. You've got malaria, and in all probability, COVID-19, will find its way into these refugee camps where you do not have social distancing and other means at our disposal that we have in other settings. So it's definitely part of the refugee crisis. How do developing countries recognize these additional deaths coming from losing access to food? It's complicated formulae that I'm probably not that I'm not in a good position to answer. But if you take a look at the work of the World Food Program and other groups that come under this Food Security Information Network, FSIN, you'll see the how they kind of develop the numbers, whereby it's the most recent estimates would suggest that the number of food insecure has more or less doubled, as you know, at least the projection is that it will double as a result of COVID-19. There's a question about the food systems course. Is it available to non-MDP students? I should say no, and therefore you have to apply to the MDP program if you want to take it. I'm not going to say that because the other programs at SIPA are fantastic as well. The truth is that we do each year allow a small number of students into the program, and typically it's between 5 and 10. It depends how many DPs there are, because we try to keep the class size manageable. I don't like to have more than about sort of 55 or so, you know, in the class. So it really depends how many DPs there are, but yes, it's possible. Students have to write to me and make the case why it would be particularly useful to you. How do you see building back better? You know, good question. You know, this term building back better, ecologically, socially inclusive systems. I've been thinking about this for a long time before COVID, because you know we've temporarily stopped talking about climate change, you know, with COVID in our face. But we need to get back to thinking as well as to all the various forces that are affecting our food system. I think we have, for me, I look at sort of 5 pillars of achieving what you're describing there, Bamini, the ecologically and socially inclusive or sustainable food systems. The first is sustainable production. That's critical. So that means we do actually have to increase production in some places, but we have to do so in sustainable ways with improved efficiency, much better use of soil and water and energy. So I talk about that as sustainable intensification, because I think, in fact, some places will have to increase in yield and some places will just have to go out of production. We shouldn't even be producing in some parts of the world, and in some environments where we're overexploiting could be the water resources, it could be we're growing crops on steep hillsides where we're losing our soil and the like. So sustainable production is one aspect. We have to do a much better job of connecting farmers to markets, so that essentially what we want is food to move from where it's produced to where it's needed. And so marketing and marketing infrastructure is incredibly important. A third element is reducing post-harvest losses. Food waste, you know, we hear this number of about 1/3 of the food produced never actually gets consumed. Those numbers are being questioned a little bit lately, but it's still large, whichever way we want to look at it. And every time we waste food, we waste all of the inputs that went into producing that food. So we waste food. We waste. You know, imagine that the food system generates around 1/4 of the greenhouse gases that are emitted every year. So that means that, you know, we need to be, if we throw away a certain amount of our food, we've already generated greenhouse gases as a result of that. So food waste, food stewardship is really important. Changing diets is the fourth element that I've you know, referred to often, and that is the importance of moving towards diets that are healthier and more sustainable. And I refer you to the Eat Lancet report that came out in 2019 that describes what they call a planetary diet, a diet that's good for yourself and good for the planet. And finally, social protection systems need to be in place to help those who aren't in a position to help themselves. So these are the elements of what I think is a sustainable food system going forward. And my conclusion, in fact, is that if we do those things and we have all the knowledge to be able to do it, we can actually produce enough food and do it sustainably to meet the requirements of 10 billion people by 2050. So Eh, how deep do you go into the topic? Do you work? Yeah, I mean, I go as deep as I can go within the constraints of a 3 credit course. But what I do is, I've worked in this area for 4 decades, and I've spent a lot of that in the developing world, in Asia, in Africa in particular, but also in, to a lesser extent, in Latin America and other parts of the world. Um, I use a lot of actual cases. I give you in this course, I give the science. That's important. I want you to know the science. I don't care if you never personally end up working in agriculture, but if you end up working for an NGO or in the UN or with a private firm, and you will all come across issues related to food systems and food security. You need to understand the basic science. If not, if you're ignorant of that, you're not going to be coming up with, sort of sensible policies, for your organization, for the UN, or for your firm. So, I use a lot of case studies. I use a lot of my personal experience. I bring in guest speakers who are working in different parts of the world. That's pretty typical of SIPA, by the way. That, SIPA is, just to sort of divert a little bit. SIPA's got like amazing professors that some of them are kind of like, seriously, these are the world's leading people in their fields. Joseph Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs, these are the most world famous in their particular field. And we have a lot of practitioners. We have people like me who I'm academically not even close to those characters, but I've spent 40 years working in the field in different organizations at all levels, from grassroots to sitting in the office of the Secretary General of the UN, at all those levels. And I see myself as a practitioner. And so we have lots of practitioners who come in and teach and are part of the faculty, and many of them are adjuncts. And so, I mean, I think that's really the beauty of SIPA, to have that tremendous mix. Yeah, finish starvation. See, starvation, I think, is a kind of a loaded word. Starvation is really about acute hunger. I mean, that's when people actually die of lack of food. That's the last stage. And that's really unacceptable. Nobody should die of starvation. But my concern, too, is those 150 million children under the age of 5 who are stunted. And you saw the brain, it's smaller. Their life is restricted, basically, as a result of the first 1,000 days of their life. So that is a much bigger proportion of the people who are going hungry, are the people who are chronically hungry and malnourished, a kind of a silent malnutrition. Okay, they're a little bit shorter than other people. You don't see it that much outwardly, because a lot of people are short and they're not stunted, but some are as a result of the malnutrition. But it's not what you see on the outside, it's what's going on the inside. And that really restricts their educational opportunities. And there's all the research out there to show that affects their lifelong earnings. So chronic hunger is extremely, extremely important. Okay, what was that one? Do you think may decrease resistance to adopting technologies? Well, I hope so. I hope so, because I think one of the problems we have in this world at the moment is the idea of people, of being for and against technologies, instead of assessing and looking at evidence. In America right now, and there's a bunch of you still, I mean, you're from all over the world, but a few of them from America. Basically, you're either for or against wearing a face mask at the moment. Ridiculous, insane. There are people who are for and against vaccines. There are people who are. So look, the thing is, what you'll find at SIPA is we'll talk about these things. We'll talk about the different sort of social debates that are going on controversial issues like that. In fact, in my class in food systems, we actually, every year we have a debate on GMOs. And the debate is, and this is the question we address in the debate, are GMOs compatible with sustainable food systems? Think about it. And the rhetoric on some sides would say, well, of course not. GMOs, they're bad for the environment. They're bad, like there's a very negative view of genetic improvements that are now categorized as GMOs. At the other end of the scale, there's those who believe only that, technological solutions will solve everything. And, whether it's, a new app on your phone or a new form of genetic editing, to improve nutrition or to improve, drought tolerance of crops or something, that's the only solution. So what we do in SIPA, and we certainly do it in my program and in my class, we really confront a lot of these issues and we really dig into what's the evidence here? What is the evidence on human health? What is the evidence on environment? And we have some very, very constructive and useful debates coming out of all that. Okay. And I'm not going to give you my answer to the question because you actually have to come to SIPA if you want to know the answer. In the UAE, food security is included in the national security strategy. Do you think we'll be seeing more nations adopting? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Even before COVID-19, and again, this is another interesting topic that, food is also a weapon, right? I mean, it is a key thing for national security. Countries need to want food security. And the thing is, that doesn't mean I don't want UAE to be growing all its rice using desalinized water. That would be a very poor use of resources, all right? What countries need to do is achieve food security through a variety of means. Now, some countries can essentially produce most of the food that they need themselves. They're blessed with land, they're blessed with water, and human resources and capital to be able to produce food sustainably. I don't think, countries in the desert, are really in a good position to be doing that. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't pay attention to food security. Their food security might be through their relationships, the trading relationships with other parts of the world. And, COVID-19, as I said, despite the extraordinary impact that it's had on the world economy, food is still moving. Food is still moving, and as I mentioned in my talk, it's hardly increased in price at a global level. So what's really important at this time, and in fact, when countries start to panic like that, like when countries close their borders and say, we're not going to export food anymore because we want to look after our population, even though they're major exporters, or if countries go around paying double, triple the price of food, what you have is a big food price spike. That's what happened in 2007, 2008, and again in 2010, 2011, when we had a global food crisis in those years. So we don't have that at the moment. So I think I think food security is as important as military security. It should be part of an overall national security strategy, but it doesn't necessarily mean, hunker down, put up the walls, and we all produce for ourselves and worry about ourselves only. I think it actually is exactly the time where you knock down the walls and you start to say, we need to talk, we need to cooperate, we need to build friendships and relationships such that everybody, there's no question in my mind whatsoever, there's enough food, it's possible to produce enough food sustainably to feed a world of 10 billion people. We're not doing it very well at the moment, but we could do it through some of the means I was talking about. Okay.
Professor Denning, I just wanted to pause really quickly and remind folks that we have about 10 minutes left and we have so many wonderful questions. We'll try to address as many as possible.
Okay, I'll try to be shorter in my answers. Will technology play an increasing on resilience and food safety? Absolutely. Technology, if you're sort of hinting at the role of information technology, I think blockchain for marketing systems and financing systems. I think all manner of technologies from the information and IT end of things through to this new biological technologies known as gene editing and technologies beyond that. I think they're all going to play a very important role going forward, not in food supply chains, in nutrition, in sustainability. Policies that you've seen to strengthen social protections that improve food access. Yeah, there's many examples out there. I think one of the things I would like to advocate, and there are good examples, many of the big agencies are doing it now, and that is local procurement. So the idea that social protection shouldn't just mean kind of food aid from the outside, shipping in, planing in, trucking in food from the outside. If we can find ways to stimulate local producers to be able to generate surpluses, it's going to be good for them, and then it's going to be good for the consumers as well, and good for the agencies as well, because there'll be local procurement is a lot easier. I remember doing a study in Africa, and I found that if you brought maize or corn from the Midwest, from Iowa to Malawi, it was going to cost about $850 a ton. If you produced it yourself in Malawi, and we knew how, it was pretty simple formula on how to increase production in Malawi, it would cost $150 a ton. So why bring it from Iowa to Malawi if you can produce it locally for about, a fifth of the price? Do you think plant-based alternatives to meat, are they better for us in the environment? I think we're still kind of looking at that. I think plant-based foods is definitely a good development. The general idea that we need to eat more plant-based foods is absolutely that's an absolute yes, particularly for folks in my part of the world and in the United States and in Europe and places where we absolutely eat way too much meat. And not only is it bad for us health-wise, it's bad for the planet. We know that, right? So efforts to do this. Now, if you're talking about Impossible Burgers and some of these things, I think we have to be a little bit specific there and say, well, particularly in terms of, we have to look at the life cycle of the products that are included there. And we have to look a little bit closer at the nutrition as well, because some of these products that are vegetarian aren't always good for your health. It depends how they're cooked. It depends how much salt is in there and so on. So you have to examine the full picture there. Regarding the situation in Ethiopia, I read that Sudan is becoming depleted as well. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't have the answer to that one. But you look, that Sudan didn't need Ethiopia, a crisis coming from Ethiopia. And so definitely the country is challenged to even meet its own food security and to deal with its own nutrition issues without having to deal with a flow of refugees coming from Ethiopia. So, it's not a long-term solution. I mean, the solution is to prevent the conflict in the first place and to end the conflict as soon as possible and enable people to be able to come back and to restore their lives. And I've been to Tigray, and I've worked in villages in Tigray, and I know you can improve agricultural productivity, you can improve livelihoods in those settings, but you can't do it with guns going off all the time. Where are we? The role of international development. How do you figure in this view? Well, international development, it's interesting. I'm not sure what you mean. If you mean international aid programs, the role of the World Bank and all of these others, like international assistance per se. I think it's all, you know, we need, a lot of people say aid is bad, we don't need aid. But I take it back to basics. And what we need is public investment in a lot of these things, whether it's agriculture, better nutrition and the like. You know, we can't just say leave it to the private sector. We need public investment. Now, in situations where governments do not have the resources to be able to do that public investment, then the capital's got to come from somewhere. So who's going to build the road? Who's going to build the schools? Who's going to set up the health systems? And aid programs are the mechanism for doing it. It doesn't mean they're all working well. Some of them have been amazing. The Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria has had an extraordinary impact on, you know, particularly on malaria and HIV/AIDS and TB. So, you know, aid is important, but again, context is important too. And there's good aid and there's bad aid. And I hope, you know, by coming to SIPA, you'll start to sift through some of these things, and you'll start to, you know, break away from some of the dogma that might be behind you, and use those, you know, year or 2 years that you spend at SIPA to kind of really open your mind. I'd really encourage you to do that. All right. To what extent do you believe the sustainability efforts in food were derailed because of it? What do you predict? Yeah, I mean, I think that was really the point of my talk. I think what it did is, they've been somewhat derailed. Those vulnerabilities have been exposed more. You know, the undernourished people are, you know, they're not only affected by the COVID disease, they're affected by the economic consequences of the COVID disease. So it was a crisis that, you know, should not have happened, but we know, you know, did happen and probably will happen in the future. So, you know, we really have to spend a lot more time thinking about resilience and ensuring that, you know, we have better ways to respond, that we know how to respond to the pandemic, that we know how to keep those supply chains moving, that we have fewer malnourished people, so fewer people vulnerable to these pandemics and the like. Right. So talked about resilience, how to balance the enormous corporate power of governments and companies. Well, in governments, we're mixing it up a bit, the power of governments and the corporate power of companies. Yeah, I mean, that's what the role of governments is. And, you know, governments have to, you know, have to work with the private sector. They have an important role in terms of regulation. They shouldn't be doing the work of the private sector, but ultimately, I think businesses and private enterprise is a very important and essential part of the food system in terms of providing markets for farmers, in terms of being able to distribute and inputs and support trade of food, and, you know, we need everybody on board here. But we can't just say, you know, food system, that's for the private sector. No, look, I tell you, and I know we're running out of time, but my point here is that we, you know, the corporate world has enormous budgets, enormous ability to influence people's behavior. And that's why, you know, we eat sugar, you know, we have sugary drinks, we have way too much processed fatty foods. It's very much a result of corporate influence. Government needs to kind of fight back in that respect, representing our best interests and representing best interests of future generations. So we need both. And so whether you're going to work in the private sector or in the court or in the government or in the NGO sector, or even better, create your own social enterprise and use a lot of ideas from business, but apply them for the public good. And I will end on this one, and I do apologize for not being able to address all of your questions, but an exciting thing that we see at SIPA is people come from government, or they may come from the private sector, and they may, as a result of SIPA, sort of switch over. So they come from the private sector and they want to work in government, or they want to they've come from the government, and they actually they understand the power of business models. And then they say, well, I think I can create a social enterprise that uses business principles to achieve social and environmental outcomes. And SIPA is a fantastic, I got to say, it's a fantastic place to do that. I think we're better than the business school. They're not listening, are they? But in many ways, this whole social enterprise and business for social good, the business schools try to work on those things, but I tell you, SIPA is the best. All right, I'm past the hour, and it's midnight for me here in Australia, so I'm running out of steam. And
yes, Professor Denning, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I know the time difference is a little extreme, but we really do appreciate you taking the time to talk to folks. And thank you all for those of you who've joined and you've asked so many wonderful questions. Thank you for your interest. I left the link to the MPA-DP program in our chat. Please feel free to visit the website to learn more. Professor Denning, is there anything else that you'd like folks to know to stay connected, to keep on learning about the program?
No, I mean, the link to the website. Also, if you can convert my presentation, I can send it to you maybe, and convert my presentation to a PDF, and anybody who wants access to it, they're welcome to it. You can find my email address if you go to the SIPA website. You do a bit of research and find that. And if you're interested in the program, reach out to me, and I can maybe answer, or at least get one of my colleagues to be able to answer any questions you have about the program. So really appreciate that so many of you joined today. Thanks a lot, and look forward to seeing you sometime.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.